This podcast is brought to you by A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London Middlesex, both family owned and operated. By the Diocese of Huron, a community where families and individuals from Windsor to Owen Sound, Graham Bend to Port Rowan come together to worship and serve. And by Molly Maid. Make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. Welcome to the premiere episode of Season 7 of the Vickers Crossing podcast. Today, we welcome advocate, activist, and author Kevin Nye. Kevin has worked in homeless services and advocacy in Los Angeles, California, and in Minneapolis, Minnesota. Kevin writes on the intersections of theology, justice, equity, and pop culture. He was a contributing author for Theology and the Marvel Universe, and is the founder of Theophany, a blog and YouTube channel looking at intersection of God and movies. His new book, Grace Can Lead Us Home, A Christian Call to End Homelessness, is available at your local bookseller.
Good morning, good afternoon, good evening, whenever and wherever you may be. We welcome you back to another edition, another season of the Vickers Crossing podcast. The Vickers Crossing is a virtual space where faith intersects with the public square. And we are beginning a new season. It's season 7, and I'm still Rob Henderson, and I'm still the priest at Holy Trinity St. Stephen's Anglican Church in London.
He is the man. And I am Kevin George, and I remain a priest at St. Aidan's Anglican Church in Northwest London. And excited to be back at it, Rob.
It's been good. We had a nice little break over the summer, so we're glad to be back at it. I know we got a great lineup, folks to chat with over the months to come and weeks ahead. So we're looking forward to that.
And a great premiere episode today with Kevin Nye, I've been calling him Kevin Nye, the theology guy, to talk about his book, Grace Can Lead Us Home, which is great. We just actually, as we were setting up here to come on, just received the news. You'll be hearing this on a Monday, but today on this Thursday afternoon, we just received news of the death of Her Majesty the Queen of England, of Canada, of Great Britain. Just want to acknowledge that and note that, it's a particularly sad time. She's the longest reigning monarch ever.
Right. Amazing.
Born in 1926. 96 years old, the change that she's seen while she's been on the throne, and somebody who is deeply faithful and has never shied away from talking about her faith and how that instructs her own presence in the world. But sad day for everyone.
Certainly is, and certainly is the head of the Anglican Church worldwide, right? And that holds a special place to us as well. And so we hold Her Majesty and family in prayer, and I know the church will be praying this weekend, certainly, as we gather on Sunday.
As well, without a doubt. In the meantime, we also want to, as we always do here on the podcast, is acknowledge that we are gathered, at least in this part of the world, on the traditional lands of the Anishinaabe, Haudenosaunee, Lenape, and Attawandaron peoples. These are lands connected with the London Township and Sombre Treaties and the Dish with One Spoon Covenant Wampum. We acknowledge these lands continue to be home to diverse Indigenous peoples, whom we recognize as contemporary stewards of the land and vital contributors of our society. And we look forward to working together with all of our siblings in First Nations as we walk side by side towards reconciliation.
And as we return for our 7th season, some things are the same and some things have changed a bit.
Yes.
So we want to take a moment and thank our sponsors, because we do have a new one this season.
We do,
Kevin.
we do, yep.
And so special thanks to A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London Middlesex, both family owned and operated. And our thanks again to Dave Mullen, who has been such a faithful supporter of our podcast over these last few years. And we really appreciate you coming back, Dave. We're happy to be connected with the folks at A. Miller George Funeral Home. So we'll welcome them back as a sponsor.
Almost like from get-go, right? Like from day one. We had that one little year where we weren't online, but then as we shifted to this model, Dave has always come and showed up. So thankful to you, Dave. Excited to announce a new sponsor to the podcast this year is the Diocese of Huron. You know that place, Rob?
I'm familiar.
So for those listening in further off regions in London, Ontario, the Diocese of Huron is the diocese in which Rob and I serve as priests. It's a community where families and individuals from Windsor, Ontario to Owen Sound to Grand Bend to Port Rowan come together to worship and to serve. And I want to express our gratitude to Bishop Todd Townsend for making this sponsorship possible, and for our own diocese to be supporting this important work of evangelism through this digital ministry. So many thanks.
Yeah, that's wonderful. Thank you. And to Molly Maid, make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. Our thanks to Tricia Listar and the staff at Molly Maid, back for another season. And again, we really do appreciate your support. Thanks for being part of the Vicar's Crossing.
Yes, awesome, Rob. Who have we got today? We got a big thing happening today, right? The season 7 premiere.
I'm a little worried because we're going to have two Kevins on the podcast today.
Two Kevins and a Rob.
I might be calling out Kevin. I don't know which one he's going to answer.
Both of us will answer.
Kevin Nye is our first guest on season 7 today. And Kevin is from Los Angeles, California. And Kevin works in homeless services and advocacy in LA. He's also a graduate of Fuller Theological Seminary. And this is such a great way, I think, to kick off our season, Kevin, because as you know, the topic of homelessness and how we support those most vulnerable, certainly in this community of London, but in other communities that are listening today. This is something we've been talking about, and the church has been engaged in different ways, and it's really ramped up recently. So we're glad to have Kevin to talk about this. And he's written a book which is called Grace Can Lead Us Home, a Christian Call to End Homelessness. So really looking forward to hearing what he has to say.
Yeah, we're going to get on. We're going to get on that. And breaking news as well, as I came in, Kevin is no longer in Los Angeles.
Oh, he's not.
No.
I have to update my notes.
I just learned this as we were getting ready to record here, that he's now in Minneapolis. So
wow,
I was doing
a quick move in the last 5 minutes.
I was doing time. We were confused about the time we were doing this because I had LA in my brain. But he's actually in Minneapolis. What he's actually doing now is knocking on the door. So we should probably welcome in Kevin Nye.
Let's do that.
The homeless advocate guy.
And here he is. We are so happy to welcome to season 7, our first edition of the Vicar's Crossing podcast, Kevin Nye. Kevin, welcome. Good to have you with us. We're looking forward to chatting with you today. Your new book, Grace Can Lead Us Home, a Christian Call to End Homelessness, something we've been really wanting to talk to you about. So welcome. How you doing?
Oh, I'm good. Thank you so much for having me on.
And I should say too that in the introduction before you came on, Kevin, I noted that you were an LA guy, but you've moved now. You're no longer in LA. Where are you now? Minneapolis, right?
Yep, I'm in Minneapolis. The thing you learn as a writer is that it's not like a blog when you write a book and you just immediately the words get out there. With a book, you write them and then there's a long process and they get out there. And the book went to print having me in LA, and then I moved.
I felt like I was into false advertising or fake news or something like that, because I gave Rob misleading information as we were getting ready to.
Oh, no worries. Hey, well, it doesn't matter where you're living right now. As long as you're here right now, we're glad to be able to talk to you about your new book and really issues, and an issue that is certainly prevalent in our city of London, Ontario right now. I mean, we're talking about it in the church, obviously, all the time, and it's the talk of the town, really. Lots to dive into. So I'll let Kevin jump in with our first question.
Absolutely. Well, and listen, while you're up there, look up Angela Kebab. I don't know if you've come across her yet or not, but Angela was a guest on his podcast. She's a Lutheran pastor and was quite involved with a lot of the work post George Floyd up there, and did some incredible work. I think the place is called Trinity Lutheran. They did some incredible work coming out of that. It'd be a good one for you to connect with. And a shout out to Angela if you're listening.
I will.
Wanted to start with the notion of home and what home connotes, right? You quite cleverly named the book, Grace Can Lead Us Home, a line from the John Newton hymn, Amazing Grace. Through many dangers, toils, and snares, I have already come. 'Tis grace has brought me safe thus far, and grace will lead me home. You write in a book, Kevin, that ever since the first day of your career in homelessness services, you heard the word home very differently than you did before. Talk to us about that, how you hear that word now, the word home, and say a word or two about grace being so important for the church and how we treat the unhoused and how we combat homelessness.
Absolutely. Yeah, I think so. Beginning to work in, in the field of, of homelessness, if you will, yeah, it makes you think about home differently, and makes you think about differently about what it's like to walk through your door every day and close that door, lock it, go to sleep on a bed. And after having that, experience, it just sort of like rang in my head a little bit longer every time I heard the word home in any context. And I noticed I was hearing it a lot in faith contexts, right? Used often not to describe a literal, like the literal house or apartment that you live in, but as a more kind of spiritual or metaphysical connotation, right? Where, like in the song, and grace will lead me home, isn't talking about grace is going to lead you back to your front door, right?
Yeah, back to the apartment.
Yeah, a lot of and home throughout scripture, throughout a lot of our songs and hymns, takes on this bigger quality that I don't think we always bring to the topic of something like homelessness. That home means more than just the walls, the door, the roof. It also means safety. It means a sense of kind of completeness, a sense of a place where you can rest and have respite and recovery, and I think that that's such a crucial way to look at that word to understand homelessness, because homelessness is so much more than just the lack of a physical secure space. It also has all of these connotations on a person's safety and identity and sense of uh, place and habitation, right? And so, to answer your second question about grace, really it was hearing Amazing Grace again that kind of unlocked what this book was for me, because the more I studied homelessness, because I wanted to know what exactly was causing and what could solve what I was seeing every day, is to know that we actually do have all of the methodology and all the resources that we need to end homelessness, but we weren't doing it. And when I started to ask why that was, it kept coming back to really an ideology, a specific way that we believe society is structured, should be structured, and how certain people within it deserve less than other people. And I found, much to my chagrin, that methodology was very prevalent in the church too.
Sure.
Yes,
and to me, go ahead.
So I was going to say, no, just it's like in the church, it shifts from an ideology to a very unhealthy theology.
Yes. Yeah. I think I don't know if it made it into the book, but I kind of traced that idea that, like, if it's ideological, then for Christians it's theological, right?
That's right. Yeah.
And yeah, so ultimately I find the notion of grace to completely upend that theology and that ideology, that that we would believe that anyone deserves less, less resources, less of a sense of safety, security, respite. That's the opposite of grace. Grace says, we don't get what we deserve. We get everything that God offers freely and without condition.
Right. Yeah.
And for us to turn around and respond to that in different kind, right? Sorry, Rob.
No, yeah. I was just going to say, because I just finished reading your book, and then I was jumping into preparing for Sunday, and those of us that are following the lectionary are getting a story from Luke about the Pharisees sitting around grumbling because Jesus is eating with outcasts and sinners. And I'm thinking about, gee, do you think the church ever grumbles about who we're hanging out with? Like, no. But it's the same kind of idea, right? And bad theologies that we fall into.
Yeah. But look, the book I found, Kevin, is absolutely brilliant. I think I described it to someone as sort of a little bit memoir too, because you write a lot about your own experience in there. obviously you did a placement in Oklahoma City, which was very formative for you by the sound of things, working with the unhoused. And one of your realizations was that people experiencing homelessness were not terrifying or exotic. You write, they were people I went to church with, people I ate with, people I served with, sometimes in exciting ways and sometimes in very boring ones. Though I would have to relearn this lesson again and again, I'm often retaught it to this day. I will always be grateful for the leveled ground I walked in that old church. The only thing more profound than feeding the homeless is eating with them. You go on to write about seeing ourselves, that is, followers of Jesus, in the story. If the Lord can be encountered in the face of the poor, then we must commit to listen to, advocate for, and ultimately join the unhoused in their own pursuit for better circumstances. And this ultimately comes down to what we see as ourselves in the story. Do we see ourselves as savior, or do we see ourselves as servant? Can you say more about that?
Absolutely. Yeah, I think that it's a really fundamental thesis of my book, because I've seen it play out in churches and even in nonprofits a lot, that those who sort of position themselves as helpers, they're, because of this ingrained ideology of that ultimately creates a hierarchy, right?
Yeah.
And even entered into with good intentions of helping the quote least of these.
Mm-hmm.
We very often position ourselves as still above, that we know what's best for people. We know what steps they should take and the order they should take them in, regardless of whether that person agrees or disagrees.
Mm-hmm.
And ultimately, what happens in that exchange is their humanity, their agency, their dignity is minimized,
Mm-hmm.
while I get all of the gratification of helping without that being dependent on the solution
Right.
at all.
Yeah.
And in the end, if it does fail and the person doesn't take a step forward, we then get to blame it on them instead of us.
Yeah.
And that happens in very small ways with case managers and with
Mhm.
pastors, and it happens in really big ways at service providers. And I talk a lot about rescue missions and other faith-based nonprofits that kind of position themselves to help this population, but really have a paternalistic approach to that work.
Yeah. You write about in the book about how God really does care deeply about who we see, and specifically how we see them, like the lens in which we are viewing folk. And kind of to drive that point home, I love how you opened up John 9, the story of Jesus healing the blind beggar. And this passage is about seeing, definitely, but it's also a passage that deals with sinning. And while there really isn't an exact, analogy between Jesus' time and maybe today for persons experiencing homelessness, there's a lot of, contextual factors and things that are different, but the story can get us really, really close to understanding how
Mhm.
we see and the lens through which we see. Can you tell us a bit more about how you kind of unpack that?
Yeah, that passage is so interesting. The writer uses seeing and blindness as literal and metaphor in some really creative ways. And
Yeah.
it's a story where at the beginning there's a man who was born blind, so he can't see, and he is accused of this being the result of his sin or his parents. The disciples asked Jesus, "Who sinned that this man was born blind?" So that's where those two concepts, seeing and sinning, enter the story, is right at the beginning. And the story ends not with the healing, but the story ends where the blind man has been healed, returns to his community and says, "Look, I am healed." And the Pharisees are unhappy about this. At first, they don't believe that it's the same man, and then they start to accuse him, like, how did this happen, and who did this guy who healed you say he was? And this is where we get the other famous line from Amazing Grace. All I know is I was blind and now I see.
Right.
And when Jesus is called to account on this, the story ends with Jesus essentially telling the Pharisees that you are the ones who are truly blind, and that you do not see, what's happening here, and you don't see what God's doing in the world.
Right.
And it actually ends by saying, Jesus says to the Pharisees, "Your sin remains."
Mm.
Right.
So what I do with that passage is sort of talk about how we see people is deeply connected to, what we understand about sin. And ultimately, if we look upon people and instead of asking, how can we help, or what led you to this point, in a curious kind of way,
Right.
and instead see them with judgment and assuming that they deserve what they've got, then they aren't the ones who have sinned, we are.
Yeah. And I think what I've always loved about that passage too, that connects to those experiencing homelessness as well, I think, is that in the story we're told that the person that was blind returned to their community. And so one of the things that the religious elite weren't seeing is the fact that there was a return to wholeness. There was a return to that a new, the community was whole once again. Everyone was together, because at one point this person wasn't, right? And that really got me thinking about a lot of the stuff you write about is that return to wholeness, and ensuring that people are housed and part of community as well, and not segregated and isolated and that sort of thing.
Yeah.
Well, we missed that about all of Jesus's healings, really.
Oh yeah.
Is that
Yeah, exactly.
in a society that equates, illness or disability with sin and therefore exclusion, means that the removal of that leads to an opportunity for communal embrace.
Exactly.
Yeah.
That then has economic and political implications too.
Huge implications, right? So here in this neighborhood, we're in the northwest corner of London, in a fairly well-to-do neighborhood called Oak Ridge, and there's a group in town called Arcade Mission. They've been in business, so to speak, for 25 years or more now, doing homeless advocacy and serving the unhoused. And they've now moved 10 people into 2 houses just a few doors down from the church here. And we've come alongside of that, and your book has come along at an opportune time for us in that, because we're reading, and I put it in the hands of our volunteers, and we're talking about these things. But what was interesting in what you just said, Rob, around that about community. So we just got a letter this week from one of our neighbors about what we've invited into the neighborhood. Right.
Yeah.
We've invited something into the neighborhood that wasn't there before. And it's so rich, right? Because it's like the understanding is that brokenness or sinfulness or whatever you want to call it is something that exists when you can see it like that. But it's like, listen, I could tell this person about the drug problems in this neighborhood for the last 10 years I've been ministering here. It's just behind very well-to-do doors.
Yes.
It's so it is what we see, right? It's what we see.
Absolutely.
Yeah. Let's talk about housing, because that's a big part of what you write about too, Kevin. And I just want to read a quote from the book.
You mean me or him? Right. You said Kevin. Oh, the other Kevin.
The other Kevin. Yeah. See, I knew you'd get confused.
Takes nothing.
You write in the book, housing is a consistent theme in Scripture, and the language of home and dwelling place permeates our songs and our liturgies. Yet the actual realities of housing are so often ignored by churches, which prefer to consider this language spiritually rather than literally. We cannot afford to do this, because housing is inextricable from the topic of homelessness.
Amen.
I am intentionally drawing our attention to homelessness on a macro level, because I believe that Christians are called not simply to manage homelessness, but to actually end it. And the only thing that every person experiencing homelessness has in common is that they do not have access to sustainable housing. And while that seems like, stating the obvious, it's critically important because neither the data nor the gospel allows us to ignore the way that housing inequity and injustice creates homelessness. And so I'm wondering, with that in mind, can you kind of contrast for us the merit-based housing models and a housing first approach? Because this is really the crux of a lot of what you're talking about.
Absolutely. Yeah. And the way I structured the book was so intentional, because so often when we talk about homelessness, we veer to topics like drug use, topics like mental illness, and we want to blame those things for homelessness and say, we wouldn't have homelessness if you really need to see this as a mental health crisis or a drug use crisis. And they are related, but they are not related in a cause and effect way. And what I talk about in the book is understanding them not as causes of homelessness, but as risk factors. And a great example to kind of drive that home is I mentioned that, homelessness doesn't exist equally everywhere across, and I use the United States because that's my context, right? If you go to Mississippi, right? Mississippi has the lowest cost of living in the United States, and they also have the lowest homelessness. Like that's the connection, is the affordability and accessibility of housing. And certainly no one would say that Mississippi doesn't have poverty, that Mississippi doesn't have mental illness or drug use, but all of those things don't cause a person to not be able to afford housing in Mississippi, whereas in so much of the rest of the country and the world, or the Western world specifically, they do. And so we have to talk about housing as the solution to homelessness. And that's not to say that, we shouldn't reform the mental health system, that we shouldn't, imagine new ways to help people who are struggling with addiction, or that we need new policies around drug use. Like, I'm all for that too, and that's why I get to it later in the book. But we have to start with the housing piece. And so the housing first model is what has been proven to actually address homelessness. And what it says is we put people in to housing first, that whether it's an apartment, a house, a room, we get people into safe and desirable housing that then gives people the home base, right, from which they can start to flourish in all of these other aspects. For a person who is struggling with mental illness, that's going to be so much worse if you're living on the street. Someone who struggles with addiction is going to be much more likely to use frequently, sporadically, chaotically, if they're suffering on the streets than if they have a place to sleep every night that's safe. And so, unfortunately, we've been doing it the opposite way for ever. And again, it comes back to this idea of deserving and
moralism,
earning, and and proving that you deserve housing. And so we basically hold housing out as this, prize that you get for compliance with a particular treatment plan that is prescribed to you, not made in partnership with you. And just like we were talking about earlier, if somebody fails that program, it's because they didn't really want it, or because they didn't deserve it, or weren't ready, or weren't good enough, right? Rather than saying, hey, maybe the problem is the model.
And this housing first model, we're not talking about just an idea that can work. Like you mentioned in the book, there have been places in the world that that housing homelessness has been pretty much eradicated, right? Like, and so this works.
Well,
it does.
Even here in London, I mean, back at the beginning of the pandemic, a group of service organizations in the city formed a group called WISH, which was called the Winter Intern. We had Sarah and Gil on, remember, Rob? So, but it was called the Winter Interim Solution to Homelessness. And basically, there was such a spirit of goodwill through COVID that all the organizations, business community, the city, they chunked in millions of bucks. And we put together these houses using construction trailers on vacant lots and went down to the river and basically offered people a place to stay with a locking door. This parish actually supplied $12,000 in door locks so that they had their own place to go in and close the door. And we saw a marked improvement. And there was no qualification. There was no, you got to get, you got to get clean or any of that stuff. In fact, they saw great progress of people once they were in there. Of course, now we're hearing about it again in this city, just about how bad everything is, because guess what? All those millions have dried up. But we know what works. And, like there's the 10 people down the road here are 10 of the people who were sleeping on the riverbank 2 years ago. And so they're in a very low threshold. There's staff in that house, but it costs $2,500 a month to keep them there. And when everybody was pumping in money, the feds, the province, the city, the business community, no problem. But the money's dried up. And now all of a sudden, everyone's screaming bloody murder, that down on Richmond Road, the businesses are unsightly, blah, blah, blah. Anyway, go on about that all day, but we're seeing it right here. We're seeing it right here all the time.
Yeah. And where we are in London, Ontario, there's definitely been an increase over the last few years. And with that, one thing that we see more and more of, and I'm a 10-minute drive from the church. I've never driven back and forth from the church without seeing someone standing on a corner of a main intersection with a sign or, asking for help in some way. And many people say, as you talk about in the book, Kevin, a lot of people, they're uncomfortable with those interactions, right? Sitting at the stoplight or having to walking by someone and trying to make eye contact. And again, I want to read a quote from the book. You write that you hear from unhoused people all the time about how keenly aware they are that actually people do look away and change course and avoid eye contact with them. These are impulses that we act on both consciously and unconsciously. And you continue on to say, I'm convinced that we do these things because homelessness itself, more than the individuals experiencing it, scares us. We are afraid to reckon with the way our economy and society churns out victims, and it's easier not to just look. But if we could look, what a difference it would make. If we went against our impulses and made eye contact, perhaps even smiled or nodded at one another, acknowledging our shared existence and humanity, we all might just become a little more human in the process. Can you say more about this in a bit, Kevin? Because I know in the book you mentioned, that's the one thing people ask you most is, what do I do when I'm approached or with someone? How can we maybe work at all being a little more human here?
Yeah, I think, anytime someone finds out I do anything related with homelessness, it's like it comes out of people without even realizing it, because there's just so much anxiety that pervades these interactions. And I get it. And I extend grace for that too. My book can't be about grace, and I don't extend it to, to all of us. Right. I think that we, in almost no other large scale social issue are we confronted with it in such a personal way so frequently. And it feels like we enter those interactions and it's like we're under a microscope. Like how we behave in this moment determines how we feel about this huge issue. And so the first thing I try to tell people is like, just do your best to take that pressure off your shoulders. Like, and remember that this is just an interaction with a human being who may ask you for something and you have a choice of whether or not to give it. And what I encourage people to do is to think about it ahead of time, for the frequency with which a lot of us have these interactions, we are never prepared for them. I think it's worth time just, sitting and thinking or talking with your loved ones, like, hey, when we have these interactions, what are we going to do? And I don't tell people that they should give or that they shouldn't give. I think that everyone should make that decision for themselves based on their own boundaries, their own resources, their own, hopes. But certainly don't make it based off of, myths and prejudices. And those are the types of things I try to dispel in the book. But that doesn't mean that you should give every time someone asks either, because, if you live in LA or New York or London, you probably go broke pretty fast doing that. Right. So Yeah, I hope that answers it. That's one of those things I could talk about for a really
Sure,
long time.
sure.
Well,
And
you know,
I love the one line. Sorry, Kevin. The one line that I now carry with me is because sometimes I do give and sometimes I don't. And
Yeah.
just to say, and this is the humanist, to say, I'm sorry, I can't today.
Yeah.
But that
Mhm.
one small interaction, right,
Yeah.
is huge.
I was fortunate a
Yeah.
few years back to be in Chicago and meet Father Michael Flager, and he's really very active in South Chicago, has been for decades, of course. And one of the things he said in his speech that he gave when he was there was, he said, they tell me, Father Mike, please, when you're talking to these well-off people, would you tell them not to look past us? Okay, like we don't expect them to give us money every time, but just tell them to look us in the eye, man. Like, don't look over us like we're not even there. That's the part that hurts.
Yeah.
Right.
Yeah.
Yeah.
So this is what I've been telling people, like, you don't need to do, but like, just, it is uncomfortable, perhaps at least the first few times you might do it. But once you take a habit of saying hello, or I can't help you today, as you said, it helps. You make the point, Kevin, that housing is more than a roof, a door, a walls, that you actually write about housing as something spiritual, which I really, really liked. You call it, in fact, sacred. Recently here in London, a group called the Forgotten 519, that's our area code here, banded together because of the increase in homelessness in this city. And they staged a hunger strike down on City Hall steps for 4 or 5 days till finally they resolved it with the city. And a lot of what that was about was getting them to stop breaking up encampments, because it was getting to a point where they'd move in, uh, bust down all the tents and tarps and so on. You write about this in the book and about encampments. You say, sadly, we let our fear and resentment of encampments lead us to pursue criminalization and displacement. Through a variety of anti-homeless laws, cities and states and provinces and neighborhoods prevent people experiencing homelessness from being able to establish a consistent home base. When we choose to displace people, belonging such as medicine, identification, paperwork required for housing get lost in the shuffle and discarded. And when communities are scattered, people become isolated and distrusting of services and lose faith that anyone is interested in actually truly helping them. So on this topic, can you say more about this sort of sacredness of housing, the spirituality of housing, and why this idea that we have to send in? And I'm shocked at where we won't send police. Like, we had people occupying our capital for years, for months up here in last January, and they were allowed to camp out on the front steps of Parliament, but they'll send 50 officers into a homeless camp in Toronto and just with billy sticks. So I just wonder if you can say more about that.
Yeah, and it's exactly what you're saying, that we fundamentally see in even a lot of people who work on behalf or see themselves as supporters and advocates of people experiencing homelessness are fundamentally anti-encampments, and I think that is a huge misstep and a huge misunderstanding about what encampments are, what they provide for people. And I couch that in the idea that housing is sacred, and I say that all housing is sacred, even makeshift temporary housing. I mean, let's go back to the Old Testament and talk about what makeshift housing is and how it sustained people for generations. I think that we really have to upend our imagination around what an encampment is. Encampments provide safety, they provide community, and I'll even go further to say that the big story I tell in that chapter is around an encampment that was at Echo Park in Los Angeles, and really the presence of encampments in public parks is very often the contentious issue, and where you see encampments get broken up. And the thinking is like, or the voice of the neighborhood is saying, like, why should they take over the park? That park belongs to us. We want to be able to take our kids to the playground and all of this. And first of all, most of the time they are not occupying the entire park or making it unusable in other ways. Even Echo Park, I had a toddler that my wife took to Echo Park all the time while the encampment was still there. Like, it was not unusable. It was just this,
fear of being
desire, this
Yeah.
desire for segregation and elimination of an element that this neighborhood just did not want to be there. But the reason that unhoused people choose public parks is for safety,
Yes.
right? They are public, they are visible. You can spread out a little bit. You can have a lot of people, which safety and strength in numbers, right? They're usually a little bit further away from traffic. So the things that make parks safe for kids is the same thing that makes parks safer for unhoused communities, right? And so something that happens that I didn't get to write about in the book, because it was something I kind of came to realize later, was how often when those encampments at safe places get broken up, people end up not just scattered, not just isolated, but moving to less safe places.
Right.
There was one in Salem, Oregon. There was a big story a few months ago of a drunk driver ran into the median and busted through an unhoused encampment, injured several, and killed a couple people too.
Wow.
And I was messaging with somebody who lived there and did a lot of, mutual aid work with that encampment, and they mentioned that several people who lived in that encampment weren't there a month ago, but they had been in a park that had been raided, and they'd been displaced from the park and wound up in that median.
Wow.
Which is essentially in traffic. And so that act of moving them from that safe park
Put them in harm's way.
Put them in harm's way.
Right.
And you mentioned, Rob, that a community by a riverbed. That's another one that's very common, that when people get displaced from parks, they end up in riverbeds, and then flash flooding happens. And a lot of folks die by the riverbed.
Just actually, before I ask you the next question here, just something just popped in my head as you said that. So part of the discourse here, when the hunger strike was on and the Forgotten 519 were pushing the city about encampments to stop breaking them up immediately, the argument they said was, well, we don't break up encampments. We only break them up, which is to say we don't break them up, but we do. We only break them up. And so what do you say to this argument, which is that we break them up for the safety of those who are unhoused? When we sense that it's become too dangerous, that for women who are at risk in these camps, they're at risk to predators and all this stuff. You have a response to that?
I sure do.
I thought you might.
Yeah,
that was what our mayor said he does it to keep them safe.
Yeah, and the city council person who broke up Echo Park said the same thing, right? And usually what happens is, one story comes out and they seize that story, right? Yeah. Or they'll talk about safety and sanitation, or and they'll say like, well, look, the trash is piling up, there's human waste everywhere. This is a public health issue, rather than say, hey, what solves trash and human waste is dumpsters and bathrooms, right?
Yes, and homes too.
And homes, of course. But in lieu of homes, like, we could provide
put a dumpster there.
Yeah.
Dumpster or bathroom access, and there were actually bathrooms at this park that the city council person's deputy would come every night and lock them, so that people couldn't use them.
You make great use of a bathroom with a lock on it.
Yes, exactly. So, but to the point about safety, you mentioned this earlier, that it's what we choose to see, right? Because those things happen in communities behind locked doors. They happen amongst people who are housed, right? Sexual assault is awful and horrible, and I would never want to gloss over it, but it is not unique to unhoused communities. And if there was a sexual assault or a rape in an apartment building, we wouldn't go into the apartment building and make everyone move.
No,
right?
Exactly. Yeah.
So it's a matter of just let's talk about what happened and how we address it from a safety standpoint, not, let's blame it on the community, the whole community, when really the whole point in any of those situations is we're looking for an excuse, a reason to justify doing what we want to do, which is to get these people out of here.
Right. Yeah. Thank you. One of the topics that you talk about is drug use, addictions that we do see for those that are experiencing homelessness. And you insist that the church, and this is where we really want to get into, because I know there's a lot of church folk listening today, the church is positioned and sanctioned with everything it needs to actually be a champion of recovery for those living with addictions. And I think this is real important for us to see. But that will require letting go of our need to, inflict shame, punishment on those who use drugs, even when they're using causes communal and relational pain. And again, a quote from your book, Kevin writes this: people use drugs because they work. If drugs didn't accomplish something, people would stop using them after the first or second try, long before addiction would take root. Knowing what drug use provides, the very real gap it fills, that's what's crucial to understanding it. Knowing that opioids numb pain and provide relaxation helps explain why someone experiencing homelessness might use them. Kevin, can you say a bit more about how we, as communities of faith, can really come alongside those living with addictions?
Yeah, absolutely. And I have in mind to write a whole other book just about this, because I think
that's huge.
I think we really need to get to the bottom of this right now. There's a great study that's kind of colloquially known as Rat Park, where this doctor wanted to understand what, drug use, and previously the experiment was with rats, and they were given an option between plain water and water that was laced with cocaine. And over again, the rats chose cocaine, and until they OD'd, right? The rats were in a cage, and they were given those two options. And another doctor came along and wondered, I wonder if the cage has anything to do with the experiment and not just the two options, right? And so he built what he called Rat Park, which was like heaven for rats. It was a huge open space, lots of toys, lots of fellow rats to play and mate
high-fat
with,
cheese.
and yes, like all the good stuff. And then put those same two bottles, the water bottle and the cocaine laced water. And in that setting, the rats almost never chose the cocaine water. And when they did, they didn't return to it. There, like, no addiction was formed and no overdose happened. And so it's this really helpful change of mind frame to understand that addiction does not happen in a vacuum, right? It happens in a context. And understanding that context and having grace for that context and working to resolve and change the conditions of that context need to be our foundational part of addressing addiction. Now, that's not all of it, right? Like we need treatments, we need, medical assisted treatments, like we need to, target based on the substance that's being used. There's all sorts of really great work that can be done on the treatment side. But we need to zoom out and understand the conditions that drive people to use and that perpetuate use. And a really great point that was made by a video that is where I first learned about Rat Park, talking about how our response to drug use is criminalization, is we're literally putting people in cages. It's the exact experiment that we're repeating over and over and over again, saying you do drugs, you are bad, and now let us put you in this cage to punish you for that, which is only going to drive a person further into isolation, making the conditions, that context that we're talking about, worse, and no one is going to get better.
Yeah, we're here. We got the Elgin Middlesex Detention Center here in London, where we've had 20 deaths over the last 6-7 years. because we've overpopulated the place by double. We've literally,
Mhm.
to use your rat park, it's rat hell. They've caged up double the number of
Yeah.
rats you can put in a place when they put these human beings in here, and they've cooked up whatever drugs they can in there, like, with all
Mhm.
kinds of crazy stuff to try and use. And people are literally dying out there. And from a Christian standpoint, from the standpoint of people who follow in the way of Jesus, what I found so compelling about what you write in the book is that, there is something in this where we can lead, because we actually sort of follow in this way of the one who says we strive for peace and unity among all people, respect the dignity of every human being, to come to understand that people who battle these battles are not other than beloved children of God.
Yeah.
And that we ought to be cognizant of that. And the old models of abstinence, of like, you're going to get well cold turkey for people who have severe addiction issues, is pie in the sky. How do we keep people safe?
Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, we have to, sorry, can you still hear me?
Oh yeah, you just came
Yep.
in real good now.
Oh, interesting. My headphones just died.
Oh well, there you go.
And just before we wrap up today, Kevin, you write about a posture of abundance. And you're right that Jesus preached the gospel of abundance. When we, give away luxuries to the poor, to the undeserving, we are definitely preaching the gospel. That's what it's all about. Can you kind of wrap up our time together talking to us about this gospel of abundance, and really by extension, the notion that, everyone should be celebrated?
Yeah, absolutely. And this gets back to how we started, which is talking about that there are tangible aspects to what we talk about with home, and there are also spiritual aspects of that. And what I've really learned in doing this work is that, people are more than a list of tangible needs, right? And that part of what makes us human and what makes communities beautiful is that intangible stuff, like joy, like celebration. Um, and the amazing thing about those things is that they are not a scarce resource. And that, in one sense, I want to talk about abundance and scarcity to make the point that, we actually do have everything we need to end homelessness. We just need to distribute it properly. But also, as we continue to try to work within systems that do hoard resources or mismanage them, we don't have to just throw up our hands and say, oh, we have to wait until we change the system, right? That we actually have ways that we can work with people and basically bring people into community and solidarity, and practice things like joy and celebration that make all of us more human together. And I talk in that chapter about a yearly party that we would throw at where I worked in LA, where we would just invite everyone who's experiencing homelessness in Hollywood to come onto our patio. And some years there was live music, a taco truck, a photo booth, a dance floor, all these things that, aren't about, your tangible needs, but are about, being human and expressing yourself and feeling joy and feeling part of a community. Every community has rhythms of celebration, right? Birthdays, or for religions, it's holy days, right? And when we lose those, we lose, I think, a part of what makes us human. And so I think that for anyone out there who wants to, get involved with homelessness, and even somebody who understands like how far off we are from truly ending homelessness, that there's still an invitation from the perspective of abundance, that there are resources that we can participate in and have to offer that aren't scarce, and that anyone can do, whether it's just offering conversation, hospitality, and all to the extent of offering, space as a church for people to come, even if they can't sleep there. Can people just come and hang out for a couple hours and not be policed for a couple hours of their day, not be looked at like they don't belong for a couple hours in the day. that's what I'm getting at with this idea of abundance is we have so much more to offer than we think we do, even if we don't have money or tangible resources.
Bring them in and give them a piece of avocado toast, eh, Kevin?
Exactly.
Tell the folks about avocado toast. I think that's great.
Yeah, so that's a story in that same chapter that so this was right around the time, like I want to say 2017, where this big story all around the world was a tongue-in-cheek article that was written about how the reason millennials can't buy property is because they spend all their money on expensive coffee and avocado toast. And that just rubbed me the wrong way. Like a bunch of people as a millennial who, I love avocado toast, and that is certainly not what is keeping me from owning property, right? And again, it cut to this myth, right? That certain people are just not responsible enough to deserve what we have, and failing to either intentionally or unintentionally failing to realize that the conditions were not the same and that a particular generation pulled up the ladder behind them on a lot of this. And so my way of rejecting that premise was that Friday I was in charge of breakfast for Women's Day. And I made avocado toast and served it to all of the unhoused women that came in that week, just to sort of
I want to be clear. I want to be clear with the listeners, though. If you're just picturing a piece of toast with avocado on it, you're not getting the whole picture, because there was more on it than avocado.
That's true. Yeah, no, I don't do things halfway.
And, no, I gather. So let's hear it. I mean, I love food. This is one of my favorite subjects, Kevin.
Yeah, this gets back to my, the idea of abundance is that anytime I cook or buy food for people experiencing homelessness, I want to make sure it's something that I want to eat too.
Yeah, exactly.
They deserve more than our leftovers and table scraps, right? And so when I made avocado toast, I baked the bread myself. I got fresh avocados, obviously. Cooked some bacon, broke it up to put some fresh bacon on there. They all had a fried egg on them, and then a little tahine seasoning, which is like a chili lime.
Nice.
So it was good stuff.
That's what I'm talking about right there. That's awesome. That's the way it should be.
Well, now that we got a hunger on, it'd probably be a good time to wrap up our podcast. I've got to go get something to eat. So no, that's awesome. Hey, Kevin, we really appreciate you spending the time with us today. We want to commend the book to our listeners. Grace Can Lead Us Home, a Christian call to end homelessness. This is, for pastors listening today. This is a great book study this fall, getting into the Advent season too. Maybe, if you're looking for something to gather your folks around to look at, definitely this would be top of the list for me. And hey, thank you for your work in your ministry and giving us this great gift.
Yes, thanks so much for
giving me the hour. Yeah, thank you for giving me the opportunity to talk about it. It means a lot. Again,
thanks to Kevin Nye and for his time today, and of course for the book Grace Can Lead Us Home. And looking forward to hopefully chatting with him down the road again around here.
You know what I'm looking forward to?
What's that?
Avocado toast.
Oh,
I'm going to call him Kevin Guy, Avocado Toast Guy.
That's right.
That's what I'm going to call that guy.
Put that on his t-shirt.
I love that story. Avocado toast. They tried to say the reason that he can't afford a house is because he's eating avocado and drinking cappuccino. Well, so what does he do? He goes out and he serves the local unhoused population some beautiful avocado toast. Love it.
He was polite about it, but what he was really doing was giving them the, come on.
Yeah, here too. What for? Right.
That's right.
Yeah. Well, we'll be hearing more from Kevin, I'm sure. So it was great. Thanks to him for being on.
Let's take a moment again to thank our sponsors. First, to A. Miller George Funeral Home, where each life is celebrated, and their sister company, Cremation London Middlesex, both family owned and operated. Our newest sponsor, the Diocese of Huron, a community where families and individuals from Windsor to Owen Sound, Grand Bend to Port Rowan come together to worship and to serve. And to Molly Maid, make your home a healthy haven. Call Molly Maid London today. Great start to season 7, Kevy. And we'll look forward to getting together again in another week or so with another great guest.
Yes, indeed. A guy called Will Willimon next.
Heard of him? Yep. And we'll chat with Dr. Willimon down the road.
All right.
But in the meantime, for our friend Ian, who hopefully will be with us next time, I'm Rob Henderson from Holy Trinity St. Stephen's.
I'm Kevin George from St. Aidan's Anglican Churchy.
And in case you forgot, Kevin, remember to always look both ways.
Well, as you can see, if you're watching this
Like
before
literally.
you cross the street, because it doesn't always end well.
Thank you for listening. Our hosts are Kevin George and Rob Henderson. Our producer and composer is myself, Ian, with original artwork done by Elizabeth Dodman. If you have any questions or want to know where to find us, tweet us at Vickers Crossing or find us on Facebook at The Vickers Crossing. If you have any other questions about anything heard on this podcast, leave us a comment or look in the description to find out more. Thanks!